Hey everyone. Hey. So I'm going to read. Look, I'm starting 1 minute early, and this is strange for me because I'm usually like 5, 10, 15 minutes late for these lives, but I'm trying to make up for lost time. I'm trying to stay on time. So I'm going to start a little bit early, and already we have some chats. So you have a low key vibe says, I'm here for this debate, honey, right? Right? Hey, Empress Lisa. Hey, girl. All right. So I got into like this little silly debate on a video about just like Latin, like race and ethnicity in Latin America, right? And I made a comment saying that the majority of people in Latin America are either of African descent or mixed African descent, like the majority. They were like, no, that's not true. And then someone came on and said they were equal. We're not as bad as Americans. America was so horrible. And yes, slavery in America was absolutely a horrible thing. However, slavery in Latin America and slavery in America, they were distinct, but you really can't sit here and say one was straight up better than the other. And so this was the argument that this person was trying to make. I just want to show you some of the comments so that, you can understand the arguments made. So I initially saying that Africans were seen as equals is an exaggeration. Here's an excerpt from the academic journal, America's Quarterly, right? So this journal says the Inter-American Development Bank estimates that Afro-descendants represent one-third of the Western Hemisphere's total population, with the largest concentrations living in Brazil, the United States, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. So it goes on to say, the quote from the academic journal goes on to say, across the region, Afro-descendants are more likely than others to live in impoverished areas affected by high rates of crime and violence. Okay. I want you to keep this in mind, okay? Like, I want you to keep this part in mind because I'll use it to make a point later, all right? So let me just read the sentence one more time. In the academic journal, America's Quarterly, it says, across the region, so across the Western Hemisphere, Afro-descendants are more likely than others to live in impoverished areas affected by high rates of crime and violence. So they mostly they have higher odds of living in poverty than any other group, okay? This is coming from an academic journal. This is a fact. Now, I want you to hold on to this because I'll be using this fact later on to make another point. Also, it says here, racial inequality is further exacerbated by structural economic factors, including deep income disparities, and a minimal socioeconomic mobility among Afro-descendants, okay? So we're talking about wealth, right? Like, no one wants to talk about this. People love to look at racism as if it's like an attitude thing, as if it's just completely social. It's not about just the social aspect. It's not about just the political aspect. It is deeply economic. When we think about why colonialism happened, why imperialism happened, and why slavery happened, and these three things are deeply intertwined and inextricably linked, we have to take into account that the driving factor was money, wealth, capitalism, right? And the source of all wealth is labor. So, a lot of these European nations colonized and imperialized and the world and enslaved the people of the world in order to get an upper hand and create their system of wealth, which is what we know as capitalism today, right? So it's about money, okay? First and foremost, it's about wealth, economics, money, labor, all of that, okay? All right, so I'm going to make this bigger so we can look more at some other points. And so the person who was attempting to debate me, even though he never presented any type of facts or excerpts like I did, all I was doing was presenting facts. Like, I never said anything that I didn't back up with facts. This person didn't back up any type of facts. He didn't back up anything of what he was saying with facts. So he said, equal enough in dignity to marry and mix with. Okay. He said, you complain that you're not accepted, but in Hispano-America, Africans clearly are accepted. That doesn't mean everything is perfect. This is Earth. Nowhere is perfect. But the point stands that Africans were not marginalized and shunned. They had mechanism to ascend to some of the highest offices available to people short of being king of himself. Okay. Cool. You want to say that there is, if you want to make the argument that people of African descent had better opportunities and better access to upward mobility than, say, the Americas, okay, you can say that. But just to straight up say that African people or Afro descendants were not marginalized is a straight up lie. Because slavery is the ultimate form of marginalizing someone. And many Black people in Latin America were brought over to the Western Hemisphere as slaves. Then this is a fact. Like, this isn't something you can argue. It's heavily documented. But anyway, I'll keep going. It gets worse, y'all. It gets a little worse. Then he starts to ask me, do I have a man? And that's like it was really disturbing to me that he did this. So he says, do you have a man? Let's get you a good, handsome, and strong Hispano man to put a ring on it and take care of you for life. Okay, that has nothing to do with anything. And it was like, this is how cringy a lot of men are. I get it. If you are an attractive woman in some of these spaces, you're going to get comments like this, but this really has nothing to do with anything in this conversation. But anyway, I say, again, an exaggeration. Plenty of racists force themselves onto Black women without marriage, causing mixture. And I quote another phrase from an academic journal. I say, for a number of Latinos, our African and indigenous ancestry is more prominent than it is for Latinos whose European ancestry is more pronounced. In fact, Latin America and the Caribbean have long histories of subordinating those of African and indigenous ancestry. Okay, and this is from her piece, Racial Subordination in Latin America by Tanya Catari Hernandez. Okay. So again, I'm supporting whatever I'm saying with facts and scholarship, something this person has not done. Okay. Okay, now this is my favorite part of it. This is my favorite part, and I'm going to back this up with some literature right now. This is my favorite part of the quote unquote little debate that I had with this person. Okay, so he says, how is it an exaggeration? Meaning, when I tell him that people of African descent in Latin America were not treated equally, right? So he's saying, how is it an exaggeration if most Hispanics of African ancestry are highly mixed compared to African Americans, right? And I have to remind him that just because you're having mixed race babies doesn't mean that there's this racial equality. It just doesn't mean that, right? Yes, in North America, anti-miscegenation laws were a lot more common, right? You had laws that were put in place to make sure white people were decentivized from marrying Black people. Black people would be punished for looking at or whistling at white women. Like, if we think about Emmett Till, how he was mutilated for like allegedly whistling at a white woman. I mean, yeah. That existed. But guess what? When Europeans colonized the Americas, I'm talking about all of the Americas, right? I'm talking about North America. I'm talking about Central America. I'm talking about South America, the Caribbean. When they colonized this area, rape and sexual violence was a tool to conquer. It was a tool. They leveraged it as a tool to conquer. Because when you rape someone and when you rape someone's women, that psychologically F's people up, okay? And it was a very common tool. So I say, you are not taking rape into consideration. Here's an excerpt from the New York Times. Some commenters insist that there can have been no such thing as sexual intimacy between a Black enslaved woman and any white man, a slave owner or overseer, or even a mere stranger, because mutually desired sex requires choice, a power denied to slaves by bondage, okay? All right, so that's out the way. So now I'm going to start getting into some actual literature, all right? Hey, Xtina. So Xtina had the video that I got into this little back and forth. It was her video that I was doing this on. I was commenting on. Hey, VC. Hey, girl. But this idea is ridiculous that just because, Latin America is more mixed that, Black people were treated equally. That's just not true. If Black people were treated equally, they wouldn't have been enslaved. That makes no sense. And it's like, you really have people running around thinking like this. Like, you don't understand how many times, slaves were raped. Like, that's not that's nowhere near equality. All right. And it's heavily documented. All of this is heavily documented. I mean, the admixture, the ethnic mixture, between Europeans, natives, and Africans, a lot of that came from rape. Not all of it, right? But I'd say most of the Black mixing, like most of the procreation with Black people living in the Americas, came from rape. And I'll tell you why. Remember how I showed you earlier that it said that most Afro descendants in Latin America, or just in the Western Hemisphere in general, are more likely to live in poverty than anyone else, right? Now, when you marry, if what this person is saying is true, right? If it is true that it was mostly marriage that led to this mixture, then most Black people wouldn't be living in poverty. And I'll tell you why. Because when you marry someone, that is a legal binding contract that usually leads to an inheritance, that usually leads to wealth being passed on from generation to generation to generation. Now, if the Spaniards were really marrying Africans, particularly Spaniard men, if Spaniard men were mostly marrying African women instead of raping them, instead of having just these sexual relationships with them, then you would see many, many more African people throughout the Western Hemisphere, throughout the Americas, having wealth. But you see throughout the Western Hemisphere, you see through, North America and Latin America, that Black people do not have the wealth, because the mixing doesn't come from marriage. If the mixing came from marriage, wealth would be distributed more equally, and it's not. So I want to read to you the part where it talks about wealth and poverty. All right. Let me see if I can get this. Okay. All right. So he's claiming that Africans were treated equally because they were equal enough in dignity to marry and mix. But most of these mixtures didn't come from marriage. It came from either rape or people just using other people for sex. It just didn't come from marriage. Okay, let me see. Okay, here we go. So this is my little caption that I added to explain to him that what he was saying wasn't an exaggeration. Him claiming that Africans were treated equally was an exaggeration. And this is some of the proof that I provided. Okay, so right here it says, I'm saying to him, saying that Africans were seen as equals is an exaggeration. Here's an excerpt from the academic journal America's Quarterly. The Inter-American Development Bank estimates that Afro descendants represent 1/3 of the Western Hemisphere's total population. So that's North America, Central America, South America, right? With the largest concentrations living in Brazil, the United States, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, right? This is the really important part. This is the real proof. It says here, across the region, Afro descendants are more likely than others to live in impoverished areas affected by high rates of crime and violence. Racial inequality is further exacerbated by structural economic factors, including deep income disparities and minimal socioeconomic mobility among Afro descendants. And this is throughout all of the Americas. So Latin America is not special when it comes to how, they subjugated African people. It's not like a special place where all Black people lived in peace with other races, or all mixed people. Everybody was mixed and just happy and living wonderfully. That's just not true. And the legacy of enslaving African people is apparent in their current impoverishment in the whole region. If these white colonizers, if these white Anglo-Saxons, if these white Spaniards, if these white Frenchmen were marrying these women that they had sex with, you would see a lot more wealth being passed down in the indigenous and native communities throughout the Americas and in the Afro communities throughout the Americas. But you don't see that because they weren't marrying. They weren't marrying these women. They were raping them and using them. Anyway, I'm going to show you an article that further supports my claims. Okay, so here we have an academic journal called Race and Ethnicity from the NEH Summer Institute for School Teachers in Oaxaca, Mexico. Now, you know, like people want to say that, oh, you're getting your information, you're just coming from an Anglo-Saxon perspective. Yes, I'm a Black American, but I'm going to use these sources that come from actual Latin American scholars from Latin American countries, okay? But even though this is like a really important conversation that we all have to have if we are living in the Western Hemisphere. It's not like, oh yeah, America is separate. Like, listen, we all have the same admixture, just different degrees of each thing. Like, you have all the Americas had indigenous people before Europeans came. Many of the Europeans came with millions of Africans. So all of us have these three ethnic groups in our genetic makeup. Some of us have more European, some of us have more African, and some of us have way more native. But these three genetic, you know, components are here in all of us in the Western Hemisphere, for the most part. So I just want to read, this is the last thing, because I want this to be quick. I don't want this to be a really long live. But here you have this right here. Now, let me tell you, if rape wasn't as common as people want to believe in this region, they wouldn't have this picture. Like, an artist wouldn't take the time to make this picture, to do this artwork. You see right here? Look at this. Listen, it says right here, do you see the caption under the picture? Do y'all see this? It says, a Spanish conqueror raping an indigenous woman, Diego Rivera mural. Okay, this stuff would not exist if it didn't happen. You wouldn't have artists depicting this if it wasn't so common. All right, let me read to you what this says, okay? Because they want to talk about their mixtures came from marriage. Oh, all of our mixtures, we're all mixed and equal because we married each other. We saw everybody as equal and we married each other. That's a lie. That is a lie. Because if it was mostly marriage, like I said, you wouldn't have so many indigenous and Black people living in poverty in all of the Americas. It wouldn't be around. Because that wealth would have been passed on from generation to generation to generation. So it says here, mestizos. Spaniards began having mixed heritage offspring fairly early on in the conquest and colonization period. In fact, rape and conquest was fairly common. But other sources for mixing arose when elite indigenous women were seen as desirable marriage partners because they might come from privileges for taxation and labor drafts among the local communities. All right. So they were raping most of these women. They only wanted to marry the women that came from elite status so they can get the tax cuts, like it says. Okay? So they can get the benefits. But usually men, are exploiting women that they colonize. So it says Spanish nobles and overseers would also take advantage of indigenous women servants in the domestic sphere. So they listen, like, you don't believe these people. Like, if we ignore what has happened to women all over the world, like, we are doing ourselves a disservice to truly understanding human history. And when you don't know or understand history, you know what they say. You are doomed to repeat it, right? So it says right here, Spanish nobles and overseers would also take advantage of indigenous women servants in the domestic sphere. The child that was born of both Spanish and indigenous heritage was labeled mestizo or mestiza. Okay? And we have a picture depicting that. Now, they talk about Africans. All right? Now we're going to talk about Africans. Castas. It says right here. Look, no one is making any of this up. Spanish colonizers also took advantage of subordinate African women, especially slaves, and produced mixed heritage offspring that came to be called mulattos in Spanish. These people could have a slightly lower status than mestizos, in part because some mestizos descended from indigenous nobility, and their Spanish heritage was also perceived as a potential positive. Mulattoes were more likely to descend from slave labor. It don't even say nothing about these men marrying the African people. Notice that how in this Research Institute article that comes from Osaka, it doesn't even mention how the Spaniards would marry African women. It said, yeah, some Spaniards would marry the indigenous women if they came from nobility and had high status so they could benefit from the tax breaks. They could get special benefits from the local communities. But because a lot of these African women were enslaved, they didn't want to marry them. They just wanted to use them and rape them. So a lot of the mixture you see throughout the Americas, it doesn't come from this kumbaya, we see everybody is equal type of deal. It doesn't. And there's way too much documented evidence of this fact for people to be running around really believing this. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. You have people really thinking, oh yeah, everybody was equal because everybody could mix and marry. Everybody was equal because everyone could mix and marry. No, a lot of people were raped. A lot of people, and if you were an enslaved woman, you had no choice. It wasn't a choice whether or not you wanted to have sex with someone or not. Like, yo, these lies really disgust me. They're lies, yo. People be lying. But anyway, like I said, this came from NEH Summer Institute for School Teachers in Osaka from 2015. So this is relatively recent, and I just wanted to show you one more article to let you know how common this was. So now when we move up to North America, which is also relevant because a lot of the European colonizers had the same practices for colonizing and enslaving people and subjugating them. So I wanted you to see this, and this is going to be the last thing. And I'm going to have to head out because I got things to do. All right. Blah, blah, blah. This is really brutal. So I'm not going to read the first part. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to read this part. Now I want you to look at this picture. All right. This is from a play, and this was very common. All right. This was like the norm. And I read an article before this, I was researching articles to present to you for this video, and I ran across an article that said something along the lines of race mixing in North America was much more common back then. It's not a coincidence that the average Black American is 17% white. How do you think that happened? And they had a whole bunch of anti-miscegenation laws that prevented white people and Black people from marrying. How do you think the average Black American is 17% white? Damn near 20%, damn near a quarter. A lot of Black Americans are damn near 1/4 white. How do you think that happened? But anyway, let me read some of these comments. James C. says exactly. Racists always uses mixed race as an excuse to justify their horrible atrocities against people of color. If we all equal, then why us Black people still suffering from oppression? Exactly. I mean, I showed you guys earlier in the video, I showed you an academic journal called America's Quarterly. So it said like, hey, most people of African descent throughout the Western Hemisphere, North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, live in poverty. Thank you, Wade Williams. You're so kind. Thank you. I really appreciate it. But I just want to read one more thing before I head out. Okay, I want to read this right here. Let me see. All right, so I need to pause for a few minutes right here because I'm seething with rage. As unimaginably horrific as a lifetime of rape is for a little girl, it wasn't the exception. It was the rule. Raping Black women in the Western Hemisphere was not the exception. It was the rule. So this idea that people of African descent were somehow treated equally in Latin America is a lie. This happened everywhere in the Americas, where you had millions upon millions upon millions of Africans shipped over to the Americas to be enslaved. You think somehow they were only raping Black women in North America and not in Central America and the Caribbean, in South America? You think somehow that was the case? When there's documented evidence, plenty of it, that shows that a lot of most Black women were raped. That's because they were enslaved and they didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice. All right, let me move on to the next one. Let me see. All right, let me continue to read this part of it. So I'm going to read this one more time. I need to pause for a few minutes right here because I am seething with rage. As unimaginably horrific as a lifetime of rape is for a little girl, it wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Dirty old white men, middle-aged white men, and young white men during slavery legally did whatever they wanted to do sexually to enslaved women and girls, as well as enslaved Black men and boys, whenever they wanted to do it. And the white wives and white daughters of these white rapists and pedophiles were complicit, which is why, as McLaurin added, many of those white women would blame, like the little slave girl, the rape victim, as the dark sensual temptress who seduced white men. So here's some of the legal parts of it. People like to just ignore the legality of wealth in marriage and mixing, right? Like I said earlier, if it was marriage that was the main factor in creating this mixture that we have in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas, then you wouldn't see so many people of African descent living in poverty. Because if these white men were actually marrying the women that they had sexual access to, then you would see a lot more wealth in the Black and indigenous communities, because they would have got inheritance. They would have inherited land. They would have inherited money. They would have inherited businesses. But you see, most of these things are controlled by white people, because white people weren't really marrying Native and Black people. White men were not marrying the Black and Native women that they sexually exploited. They were not marrying them. So don't believe these lies that you see online, okay? All right, with that said, I have to go. I'm really tired. I have work to do. But I'll see you lovely people later. Thank you, Wig Williams, for the donation. I really appreciate it. And if you see anyone else make these comments about how in the Americas we're so mixed because of marriage, you make sure you hit them with the facts. Okay? All right. Bye.